Welcome to tonight's IOP Forum on the Future of the European Union, an event which is co-sponsored by the Kennedy School European Club and the Institute Students Advisory Committee. I'm Calypso Nicolaidis, Assistant Professor of Public Policy here at the Kennedy School of Government, and I'll be the moderator for the debate tonight. We are sorry to announce that the French Ambassador Jacques Andréani is unable to be with us tonight due to last-minute official duties in Washington. Stanley Hoffman here has kindly accepted to present the French view of the European Union. Since he was going to be our moderator, I have accepted to be the moderator instead of Stanley. We thought that since many believe that the future of the European Union lies with variable geometry, we would make a little demonstration here with this panel. So let me welcome our three panelists here tonight, Shirley Williams, Rudolf Lubers, and Stanley Hoffman. Since I hope that we will uncover points of controversy during the debate between our three panelists, let me say up front that our panelists have at least two things in common. First, they are all of them European citizens who at the same time have a special relationship with the United States. And second, they have all greatly contributed to the European project, each with their own personal blend of idealistic vision and healthy realism. So to share this vision with us tonight, each of them will speak for about 10 minutes or so, and then afterwards we will open the floor for questions. So let me first introduce Shirley Williams. As many of you know here, she's Public Service Professor of Electoral Politics here at the Kennedy School and Director of Project Liberty, a project devoted to supporting Eastern European countries in their transition to democracy. She has had a long and brilliant career as a politician in Britain and now leads a double political and academic life on both sides of the Atlantic. Shirley Williams, as many of you know, was a member of the British Parliament for the Labour Party between 1964 and 1979 and was Secretary of State between 74 and 79, first for consumer protection and then for education and science. She was a co-founder of the Social Democratic Party in 1981 and its president between 82 and 88. Her party merged with the Liberal Party to form the Liberal Democrats, and as all of you know who follow European politics and British politics, the Liberal Democrats are certainly, this is an understatement, the most pro-European party in Europe. And I mean in Britain. Maybe I'm overstating it here. Shirley was created a life peer 2 years ago and has since then been one of the most active members of the House of Lords, especially regarding European affairs. In her knowledge of and dreams for the European Union, Shirley Williams may not be a typical British politician. Yet I think she is inspiring increasingly many inside and outside the UK border, and we are certainly very lucky to have her here with us at Harvard. Thank you, Shirley.
Thanks very much, Calypso. Largely undeserved. Well, let me start by saying that the European Union remains, I think, an amazing experiment. It's easy to forget that. It's easy to get bogged down in the details of particular directives or particular arguments about regulations and so forth. But it remains a remarkable, innovative step forward in institutional development since the Second World War. And as it pursues its path towards closer union, I think it deserves respect and indeed some admiration because there are not many other examples of attempts to follow it without going into the details of other attempts at common markets and free trade areas where an attempt is being made to build a political and military dimension. Let me then say very quickly, of course, that the Intergovernmental Commission, or the Intergovernmental Conference, which is to take place in 1996, is going to have to deal with some very difficult problems for the community, and I'll come back to those in a moment. But before I do so, let me say that, of course, the next great stage of the European Union is its enlargement, which has just taken place, to cover Austria and 3 of the Scandinavian countries. The enlargement that lies beyond that is the one that will include the Visegrad group of Central Eastern European countries, almost certain to take place around about the turn of the millennium. And what's really happening is the emergence of the European Union as one of the great regional blocs and one of the great power brokers of the world. Having said that, one has to say that there are certain serious problems that confront the Union. The first of those is that its member states are in variable states of difficulty. And let me just mention 3 member states, all of whom have, I think, serious problems. One of them is my own, a country which is, in a sense, in a sort of nervous breakdown. A nervous breakdown for the straightforward reason that it is a country that has still not fundamentally come to terms with a difference in its position in the world. I think that partly the special relationship with the United States, partly the existence of the Commonwealth, both of them, in a sense, very good things, have allowed the British people to kid themselves that they still have a more significant world role than they have. And so one of the most difficult problems for a politician, and particularly a pro-European politician in Britain, is to bring home the unattractive and difficult message that Britain should play a much larger part in the European Union, because, to put it bluntly, that is the only part that she can effectively any longer play. That isn't a message that many people want to hear, and one of the things that I find disturbing, but also one has to state it quite directly, is that there is now a section of the Conservative Party that is playing to the most xenophobic and the most nationalistic of public and populist moods, and that presents a considerable danger. The European Union has in turn, like the corn market laws of the 19th century, cut its way through both of the big British political parties. It came close to wrecking the Labour Party in the 1970s, when some of us left the party because it adopted a position of wishing to leave the European community as it then was. And in the last few years, it has come close and may still divide the Conservative Party to the point where it cannot survive. At the present time, it's appropriate that John Major, our Prime Minister, is the son of a circus artist because he's having to straddle 2 horses literally galloping in different directions. It isn't only the UK, however, although it's the most publicized, that has real difficulties. Spain has real difficulties too. Real difficulties partly because the Spanish democracy is still in some ways in quite a fragile stage of evolution, and secondly because, as you know, the Spanish government at the present time is dealing with really difficult economic circumstances which are pulling it away from the convergence criteria laid down in the Maastricht Treaty rather than towards it. The third country I could mention obviously Portugal and Greece, but for lack of time I will concentrate only on the larger countries. The third country is France, where Mr. Chirac has now interestingly come out in favor of a single currency, a move of a less enthusiastic kind than Monsieur Balladur, but where nevertheless I think that France herself is going through some considerable difficulties as she sees the locus of power in the European Union moving towards the east, especially with the second enlargement coming down the track. The second thing I want to say is that in my view, the Maastricht Treaty has left us a difficult legacy. That difficult legacy is to see the next milestone of European Union development in terms of a single currency. My own view, and I may as well put it forward because Calypso wants us to be controversial, is that it would be much more sensible for the European Union to see its next milestone in the area of the gradual integration of foreign policy and defense. Because the problem that now confronts Europe in the starkest form is the problem of insecurity and chaos in the continent, because although I personally do not regard either Russia or Ukraine as major military threats, I do regard the instability which grows deeper as you move east in the old continent to be a serious problem. And I think the only safeguard for that security in political terms is now the European Union, not the United States. The United States continues to be the ultimate guarantor of the safety of the European continent because it possesses the nuclear deterrent. But that's a very different thing from saying it is the guarantor of political stability, which it no longer is or wishes to be. And in my view, therefore, the European Union inescapably must take up the burden of producing the framework of political outcomes on the European continent. In this context, let me pay tribute to France, because I think that although many of us regarded the Balladur plan as a rather complex and somewhat ineffective plan, the way in which it is encouraging Central and Eastern Europe to sign on for dealing with ethnic minority problems and for committing itself to the upholding of human rights is a very important part of the way in which the enlargement of Europe is being developed. Finally, for lack of time, let me say why I think the single currency is perhaps not as easy or straightforward a way forward as defense and foreign policy integration. And here I reveal my own doubts about it. I'm not against the concept of a single currency. I believe it to be an essential ultimate complement to the idea of a single market. I'm deeply disturbed by the convergence criteria that have been adopted because I believe them to be essentially a very monetarist list. It's not strange that the Delors Committee consisted largely of central bankers. I wish, like the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, that we at least had employment and growth as additional criteria. Because I conclude by saying this. I think Europe is in danger of allowing itself to be dominated by the most orthodox set of beliefs, those which admittedly the Bundesbank has done well by, but in the context of German institutions that are not shared by the rest of the European Union. For example, the elaborate systems of apprenticeship for young people, which mean that unemployment among young people in Germany are uncharacteristically low. In Spain, they exceed 32%, and that spells real political danger. And my last remark, just to get things really going, is that I think one of the things the West has done is to consistently neglect, to the point of real irresponsibility, the social and political consequences of the monetary policies we are pursuing. And I believe it's essential that Europe, which has a legacy of a social market and not a legacy of a free market, clings to its belief that one cannot allow the polarization of income and wealth to go to extremes without putting at risk the whole security of the continent of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. Stanley Hoffman has taught here at Harvard since 1955. He was born in Vienna but immigrated to France before the war and became a French citizen. He carried his French roots with him as he immigrated to the United States to teach here, where he became the Douglas Dillon Professor of the Civilization of France at the Gov Department. Stanley has been the chairman of the Center for European Studies at Harvard since its creation in 1969, and now is continuing to be his most active inspirer. In this process, he's inspired generations of European scholars and PhD students, and one testimony of this inspiration is a recently published compendium of essays in honor of Stanley Hoffman that testify to the breadth of the scholarship that he has inspired. Stanley Hoffman's interests and knowledge span a vast territory. At Harvard, he teaches French intellectual and political history, American foreign policy, the sociology of war, international politics, ethics and world affairs, modern political ideologies, the development of the modern state, and the history of Europe since 1945. He has written numerous books, among which Gulliver's Travels, Decline and Renewal, France since the 30s, Duties Beyond Borders, and the New European Community. A compendium of his essays on Europe in the last 3 decades has just come out and is entitled The European Sisyphus. Let me say finally that as a French citizen myself, I think that France is fortunate to have Stanley as an inspired voice for France in the United States, an intellectual bridge across the Atlantic, and one of the most insightful analysts of France's modern history. Stanley.
whoever said that there are difficulties between professors and their former students. I'm not going to speak as an official representative. It would be rather difficult these days to be an official representative given the election campaign in France and the uncertainty about what happens next. So I'd just like to make a few remarks about France and the future of the European Union. There are a number of topics that Shirley covered, which I will not repeat, except to say that I agree entirely with many of her remarks, particularly the last ones concerning the lack of a social dimension and the costs which this might entail. But there's one big difference, it seems to me, between the Britain that she described and France. It seems to me that in the French case, the belief in the role that France must play as a great country is to be found much more in the elites. If one asks this mythical beast, the average Frenchman or Frenchwoman, one finds that on the whole, everybody realizes that it is at best a middle power, and that the real problem is how to be a middle power when one is situated where France is. Now, it seemed obvious until a few years ago that the choice for a sort of pragmatic European integration was very widely accepted. That the arguments which had been made left and right about European cooperation or integration as the only sensible road for France had been accepted. And then came the surprise of the referendum on Maastricht in September of 1991. As you may remember, more than 49% of the electorate voted no. So that obviously shook up the political elite. And also the political commentators. There were about as many explanations as there were commentators, largely because none of the received theories about how French behave seemed to make any sense. It was not left versus right. It was not entirely a class vote, although there were some elements of this. Some saw it as a vote of the archaic parts of France clinging to the myth of French independence against the modern parts of France. Unfortunately, that was not fortunately not entirely true. Some of the parts of France that voted yes were among the least industrialized, Burgundy, for instance. Some saw it as a yes vote in areas which were Catholic and hierarchical and less disposed to obey the elites versus more egalitarian and less Catholic areas. Nobody really knows. I think that part of it was also the circumstances. And there was a great lesson in this, which is what happens when you suddenly introduce the electorate into things which had been kept mysterious to the electorate for so long. After all, the publics, the electorates, had been kept out of the process. And in a sense, it was a way for voters who had felt excluded to remind the leaders rather rudely that they matter. But there were genuine choices. The people who argued for the no were people who thought that France would be better off with policies indeed more oriented toward growth and employment and less geared to the stability of the currency and the link between the franc and the Deutschmark. Many people thought that a more independent and protectionist France might do better than a France encased in an open and somewhat ungovernable community. Anyhow, what is interesting is what conclusions the politicians have drawn from this shock. And here I must say I find the results quite surprising, especially given the French tendency to splinter and split on everything as much whenever you can. If one looks at the campaign now, one finds a quite remarkable consensus of the three principal candidates in the presidential election. The somewhat pallid but honest socialist, both adjectives are important, candidate, Monsieur Jospin, the flamboyant and ever-changing Monsieur Chirac, who is a bit like New England weather. If you don't like what he says today, just wait. And the imperturbable, somewhat imperious, smooth, and just a little unctuous Prime Minister, Monsieur Balladur. Now, these three rather different personalities have managed to agree on a very large number of things when it comes to Europe. First of all, continuity of the European Union, no other alternative for France, including the monetary union, to which, as Shirley said, Chirac has now, for the time being, committed himself. Secondly, continuation, indeed, a very strong emphasis on the Franco-German, I don't like the word axis for reasons having to do with my own past. Let's say the Franco-German friendship as the motor of this union. Thirdly, continuity also in proclaiming a strong French interest in efforts toward the development of a common foreign and security policy. Fourth, and this is new and I think worth mentioning, a rallying, grudging perhaps, but unmistakable, to enlargement towards the East. The French have been dragging their feet, Mitterrand particularly, but not only he. And I think by now there is a realization both that the chaos or threat of chaos in the East has to be prevented or addressed, and also that it is inevitable anyhow. So if something is inevitable, one might as well greet it with perhaps not enthusiasm, but with a smile. But of course, enlargement means de facto, although nobody will say so quite openly, a much more complicated European Union with multiple speeds. It is very clear that not everybody will be able to join the monetary union, so there will almost inevitably be different levels of integration, if you like. Final point of continuity, which is something which I'm sure does not please Shirley, are great prudence when it comes to institutional reform of the Union. All the French plans are for consolidating the dominant role of the Council of Ministers or the European Council. Nobody talks about increasing the powers and the role of the so-called European Parliament, which is not at this point, which is a half parliament. And the proposals or the things that are being said about the Commission are not terribly enthusiastic on the whole. I mean, the Commission, sure, one wants to keep it, but it ought to be made more, in effect, of a servant of the Council. What is the significance of this? What lies behind these 5 points of agreement? First of all, and that I think is the heart of the matter, a consensus among the political elites that the policy which France has been following since 1950, which is a policy of, how should I put it, containment of Germany through association with Germany, is the only sensible one. Secondly, and this is where the French position is quite interesting, while there might be multiple speeds in practice, there is no desire to have a sort of official hierarchy in which France and Germany would sit in a sense alone and the United Kingdom would be relegated to a lesser position. I think that there is no desire for this in France, even though the French are often exasperated with the British on Europe, partly because when it comes to defense, Franco-British prospects of cooperation look presently quite good, and after all, the UK does not have the inhibitions on a defense policy abroad that Germany has. And another reason for this, I think, is that when it comes to the institutional question, Britain and France are much closer together, official Britain and official France, than France and Germany. Let me make a few remarks then about, put this, if you like, in perspective. I think the meaning of this consensus is that it is an effort to synthesize finally the two opposite views which have been so manifest in France since the 1950s. You've had this long debate between those who wanted an intergovernmental Europe and those who wanted a more federal one. You had a split between people who were really skeptical about the enterprise because of what it does to national sovereignty, and those who were for it. I find here a sort of quaint effort at the synthesis. Everybody wants a Europe, but it will tend to be, especially if it gets larger, much more intergovernmental than federal. And of course, one hopes that this Europe will be, if as much as possible, at the service of French objectives. Every French statesman has always said this. But that raises the important question. Europe, fine, mais pourquoi faire? What for? What is it supposed to do? And here I think there has been a fairly subtle evolution in France. Under de Gaulle and to some extent Pompidou, it was very clear that Europe was seen almost exclusively as an avenue for French leadership. This was still a divided Germany and an occupied Germany. France could find in European integration a framework that would constrain this divided Germany much more than it constrained France, which had, after all, an independent defense and an independent nuclear force in days when force seemed to matter a great deal. And the purpose, the answer to the question what for, was the slogan of a European Europe, which had a double meaning: emancipated from dependence on America and try to seduce the East Europeans away from the then Soviet grip. It may have been an overambitious policy, but it was a policy. Under Giscard d'Estaing and Mitterrand, the emphasis was less on great foreign policy designs than on the construction within this European Union, community, of a common market. These were the years of the European monetary system in the 70s, and then the single market in the less 80s. A crisis was provoked by German unification. As was quite clear, the French at first were taken aback, the Germans too, but the French particularly, because it certainly upset the previous calculations. But after a few months of confusion, to put it politely, the general consensus was, we have no alternative, we must go on. The fact that Germany is now uniting makes this policy of containment through association even more necessary and even more the only possible one. However, the context in which this policy is being pursued is, of course, very different. At this point, Germany has greater power than France, economically, certainly. It is situated geographically much closer to the heart of the reunifying Europe. And the German political constitutional system, which is a federal one, unlike France, is much closer as a model to the European complicated system with subsidiarity and all that than the Jacobin French centralized system. And therefore, over the last years, it's a few years, it seems to me that Europe has become for the French, whether they confess it or not, less a means toward obtaining what under de Gaulle would have been seen clearly as a French Europe, a Europe under French leadership and French design, than a means for avoiding a German Europe or for diluting a German Europe. And since this is not a totally unimportant objective, it is not entirely surprising that all three candidates seem to, if not proclaim it, because it's never openly proclaimed, it's like the old story about Alsace-Lorraine, think about it always but never talk about it. But this is what is behind people's minds. And let me end with 4 question marks. It looks reasonable, but there are costs and there are questions. The first question is that France until now has very strongly emphasized, with sometimes more pride than substance, its role, almost unique role, as having an independent defense. The British nuclear force is slightly enslaved to the United States force. Germany has all the inhibitions which the Allies imposed on Germany and which the Constitution imposes on Germany. And the French have always been very proud of their independent defense. How to reconcile this with a genuinely effective Western European Union that would be the sort of European substitute for a NATO whose function is sometimes nebulous now that the United States doesn't quite play the same active role that it used to, even if it says that it does, that has not been resolved. Secondly, precisely because of the differences in interests and in capabilities of the various members when it comes to foreign affairs and defense, there is one great risk of this Europe if it wants to move in the foreign policy and security area. And it's something which we have seen, alas, in Bosnia. It's the risk of collective impotence, that when you put the British, the Germans, and the French together, the agreement is on the lowest common denominator, which is zilch. The third problem, well, sometimes even worse than zilch, but I won't go into Bosnia tonight. The third problem is, of course, the clumsiness of this institutional system which the French declare themselves satisfied with. But from the point of view of efficiency, it is not at all clear, quite apart from the problem of legitimacy, that the present machinery is the best possible one. Finally, as enlargements multiply, there is for the French a nightmare which is different from the nightmare of German domination, which so far I think has certainly not materialized, and which I think the French are fairly confident will not materialize. It's a different nightmare. It's the nightmare of a final triumph of what the French look at as the British model for Europe, simply a free trade area with very few common policies, where the market reigns supreme, or where there is really no strong central power. In other words, a union which is strong enough to disarm the existing states, but replaces them only with a market, with very few common policies. And I think it's because of this that all of the French candidates, interestingly enough, continue to insist on the importance of something which is highly unpopular everywhere except in France and one or two other countries, which is the common agricultural policy, and on the need to defend European culture against American mass media and so on. It is partly genuine, but it's partly also because of the sense that there has to be some common enterprise. One knows how difficult it will be in defense and foreign policy. In economic matters, so much has, thanks partly to Mrs. Thatcher, given to the market that it's not very clear what is left really for the Union to do. All of the efforts of developing an employment policy, a social policy, have really not gone very far. So there is this frantic search for something which they can all do together so as not to be diluted into a mere free trade area, indistinguishable from the NAFTAs and GATTs and whatever others exist in this world. So these are essentially, I think, the problems which French foreign policy has to confront now.
Thank you, Stanley. Well, to take us out of Stanley's nightmare, let us turn to our third panelist, Rudolf Lubers. Rudolf Lubers is currently a visiting fellow at the Institute of Politics, and many at the Kennedy School have already had the fortune to benefit from his insights during the last 3 weeks when he's been visiting with us here. Mr. Lubers was born and educated in the Netherlands, where he originally planned an academic career as an economist. But fate and circumstances decided otherwise, as he joined his family's construction business and became increasingly active in national politics through the Netherlands Christian Employers Federation and then the Catholic People's Party. Mr. Lubers was Minister of Economic Affairs from 1973 to 1977, and after 5 years as parliamentary leader, became Prime Minister of the Netherlands in 1982. He remained in office for 12 years until August of last year. During this crucial period for European integration, he played the most important role as the leader of the biggest of the small countries in Europe. He often put new ideas on the table, such as the infamous idea of subsidiarity that Stanley mentioned, and knew how to push his ideas through. He played a very key role in the enlargements of the community, and his skills at mediating between the so-called Big Three, Helmut Kohl, François Mitterrand, and Margaret Thatcher, have become famous. Not the least because he spoke 5 languages and therefore had a definite comparative advantage over his 3 colleagues who only spoke their own native language. Mr. Lubers is one of those rare politicians who, in 12 years of office, has managed to preserve an integrity and sincerity in his devotion to public affairs that strikes anyone who meets him. In a recent IOP seminar, he introduced himself as a member of the Institute of Retired Politicians. I think it is safe to predict that the world of European and global institutions will not long be deprived of his services. And from a very parochial point of view here at Harvard, I do want to express the wish that this will not be his last visit with us. Thank you very much.
What is so important about the future of Europe? I want to address myself here at the John F. Kennedy School in the very first place to the young people amongst us, and to explain what is so important about the future of Europe. It is essential then to understand part of the history, at least the 2 pages in the book of history about this century, describing the history of Europe. It begins there, left above the very beginning of this century. Let's go back. People, so we read, are still full of memory of the German-French war then, less than a generation ago. And all over Europe, people are wrestling with how to cope with the proletariat, the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. In Russia, it is now, at the beginning of this century, full-speed modernization. But the political life is full of violence, assassinations, and those who want to give birth to democracy turn their head away from politics. Jewish people in Central and East Europe are afraid for the next pogrom, or dream to reach America. Then we read further. The First World War. Again, Germany and France. The revolution in Russia, leading to the complete darkness of communism. And then, later, the gay 20s. Life seems to be fun again. But then the crash, the crisis, the massive unemployment, and then the rising tide of National Socialism, fascism. Second World War. The liberation of West Europe, but communism expanding its darkness to Central Europe with all its oppression. There ends the left page, the first half of this century. The right page reveals us the struggle for Europe, the European community. Jean Monnet, Schuman, de Gasperi, Sticker and Spaak, all those who refused to go on accepting one war after another. They wanted to end that once and for all, ending war between Germany and France. These Erbfeinde ought to become partners in one community. The European community to be realized together with Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. That was their motivation. It proved to be a success. France and Germany are now partners. Those of you which ask me, but are there no fundamental conceptual differences about Europe between Germany and France? I must answer, yes, there are, very much. But please do realize that Europe, our Europe, is in the very first place about culture and civilization, about values based on Judeo-Christianity and humanism. It is about respect for each and every single human being. Each person has to count. It is about tolerance and pluriformity, giving scope to minorities as to majorities. It is about a Europe trying to prevent violence and to preserve respect for life as such. And finally, Europe itself, with its mountains and rivers, its wetlands and pastures, that our Europe is too beautiful to spoil it. It's true. The European community, starting to prevent war, developed into the economic community. We do not forget, when it came about enlargement, it was also, in the very first place, about values. Greece, to consolidate democracy. Spain and Portugal, again the democratic aspect. But what will Europe be without Spain and Portugal? And so it went on. In the 80s, Europe became the point of attraction for new members, Austria, Scandinavia. They also wanted to belong to, just to belong to our civilization. And now it is the same for the Central European countries. And therefore, Europe is going east to become a complete Europe. The healing of Europe after the ruptures and scars of this century, and I told you that history in short, is not only about going east. Go around in Europe, from Scotland to Catalonia, from Toscana to Galicia, and you'll find Europe in its richness, in which regions can flourish with their own identity. They can flourish, those regions, just because of the concept Europe. Europe is as a multifaceted diamond. That's what is important about Europe, not the bureaucracy of Brussels. Therefore, the most important part of the Treaty of Maastricht is its preamble, where it is about citizens and subsidiarity. In fact, about one's own identity and cultural diversity. That is Europe. Of course, that Europe is struggling again. How to cope with the new situation after the end of the Cold War? How to be a real partner in globalization? Defense identity. NATO, yes, but not less a European pillar and European defense identity. WEU. WEU heading east. And the gradual integration is what we are looking for of our military people in Europe. An integration going east. You know, after the end of the Cold War, we have to learn to think different. As the Germans say, umdenken. From the bottom up, military integration as an instrument of peace and stability. Going east and trying even an understanding with Russia, also Russia as partner and European partner. Washington, the European Union and Moscow have to share one way or another responsibilities for peace and stability on the European continent. The European Union has to give substance, especially after the Cold War and the success of preventing war in Western Europe, before that already, have to give substance to peace, a civil and civic Europe, based on the cultural diversity and richness of regions and based upon enriching each other, universities and students, business as well as churches and religions, an intensive dialogue to vitaminize each other. That struggle for Europe goes on. Europe is not a political concept to achieve, to freeze in a treaty and then to lean back, to sit down. Europe is an ongoing challenge to find new answers where it concerns quality of life. Quality of life is never given, will never become a sort of free lunch. Again, in Europe today, immigration is testing our tolerance. The deception with government is at the same time a plea for a more responsible society. Ecology is not less important than economy. You know, the essential thing in political life is to realize that you have to enter in a permanent dialogue with reality. As history proceeds, there are objective changes, demographic, technological, globalization. These are facts of life. But at the very same time, there's idealism, a sense of direction in terms of values. Spiritual energy has to confront reality, a dialogue with reality. That's in fact the mission. Such a dialogue will be the more successful if one knows about history, the lessons of history. The future of Europe is taking into account that history, which is so very much in our blood with all our tragedies. But it is now to overcome the scars and the memories, to struggle for culture and civilization. That's what really is at stake. And as far as I'm concerned, that struggle will go on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to now go to questions and answer period. There are 2 microphones here in the room. I think, are there any up there? We have 2 microphones down here. Please identify yourself as you ask a question, and remember that you're asking a question and not making a long statement. Thank you very much.
My name is Costa Stefano. I'm a student here at the school. I wanted to ask you, if Europe is going to be, if the vision of Europe, I would like to ask the panel, what is their vision of Europe? What is Europe all about? Because we've been told that Europe is about culture, it's about civilization, but the integration of the different European countries has taken place mostly on economic terms. And don't you see, what exactly is each of the panel's members' vision of Europe? And comment, I was surprised that as far as enlargement is concerned, only the Eastern European countries were mentioned. Is that because you think countries like Turkey, Cyprus, or Malta are going to be next after following the Eastern European countries, or is it because they're not as important?
Well, I suppose that the vision of Europe that you ask about cannot be purely economic. I think it's a commonly encountered mistake in this country to believe that the European Union is simply about the single market. That is, as Ruud Lubbers rightly said, the way in which, to some extent, the British government has wanted to see it, but it's unique in Europe in seeing Europe as no more than the single market. I think all the rest of the European countries, with the possible exception of Denmark, believe that there has to be a political dimension and possibly also a defence dimension to Europe, and that without that there is no vision of Europe at all. It's much more than a NAFTA, a kind of European free trade area. And it's the political dimension that is, in a sense, now uppermost, I think, in the discussions over Maastricht. So the vision as such is the vision of the creation of what is put down in the Rome Treaty, an ever closer union of the European peoples. But it's a vision which is not yet achieved and which has run into, I think, some difficulties because the European Union is not yet truly democratic. On the second part of what you say, I think there's no great problem about Cyprus and Malta, sometimes described as the orphans of Europe. I think that, one, the problem of their voting power has been overcome. They will be quite relatively easily brought into the European Union. There is a problem about Turkey. I think it's a very major and serious issue, and it's one that divides opinion in Europe between those who see Turkey as an essential, as it were, pillar to the east, to the southeast, the most unstable of the whole area of the European continent, and therefore see Turkey as being an associate gradually moving towards membership, and those who think that Turkey is essentially out with European civilization in the way that Lubbers described it. I think it's one of the most difficult issues confronting Europe. I wouldn't like to pretend there's an easy answer. My inclination personally is to move towards seeing if if Turkey cannot be brought into membership, though there may be a long transition period, because I'm very frightened of establishing an Islam-Christian border, which I think has terrifying implications for North Africa and elsewhere. But that's an issue that the audience here may want to pursue, my colleagues may want to raise as well.
It might be useful to clarify that Europe is not only about the European Union. Very important as well is the so-called Council of Europe, in which there have been always intensive debates about more fundamental questions, and therefore the Council of Europe is also functioning as a sort of antichambre to the European Union, just about the basic values. My second remark is that, I have an opinion about enlargement. I have been in the forefront with each enlargement, but I'm very much in favor to do it gradually, step by step, and taking into account geographical circumstances, which means that we had a good reason to integrate Greece, but let's face the fact, if you don't mind, Madam Moderator, it was a very difficult thing afterwards. It was not always a success. We were a little bit too brave, I guess, at that moment. So we have to expand gradually and heal the European culture that way, and that's my answer. Therefore, I prefer to be very cautious when it comes to new enlargement.
We may remind our audience that the word Europe was invented by Greece, but maybe that was his last contribution to this side.
Good evening. My name is Jean-Selim Kanan. I'm a student here as well. My question would be, why should there be hope today for a common foreign policy or Europe or defense in Europe after Bosnia?
Good question.
Stanley Hoffman say, why? Good question. He is the realist. That's very good. I'm very simple here. I think it's just a shame that Europe don't organize itself. We have had a grace period given by the United States of now already 50 years, 40 years. I mean, it's about time that we grow up and that we organize ourselves also into a defense identity, not to make an end to the alliance, not because I believe that some people do that the Americans will quit from Europe. I don't believe that at all. We have to go on with the alliance, but the minimum we can do is do something substantial in terms of burden sharing and face to our own problems. This doesn't give a guarantee for not a second Bosnia-Herzegovina in the future, because we all know how fragile and how difficult it is to do something out of area. It is not only a question of having a defense identity. Even then it will be very difficult. But I simply cannot understand that Europe could say, we go on with a concept that the United States of America in the very first place, and basically for more than 50% is responsible for security questions in Europe. I mean, we have to do our own share as well. And it is up to my French and British friends here, colleagues, who are the most responsible, I think, to achieving this, to take initiatives. And I'm glad that Shirley Williams said a few words in that direction this evening. There's hope for the future then.
Hope for the future. Well, let me just say one thing before turning it finally to Stanley, because I think that he's probably the greatest scholar on Bosnia here in Harvard. Everybody made a bloody mess about Bosnia, not only Europe, every part of the West, including also this country, because the great mistake in Bosnia was that nobody acted early. At the point at which Dubrovnik was shelled by the rust bucket Yugoslav rump navy, it could have been stopped with ease by the American Sixth Fleet and the British Royal Navy sitting in the Mediterranean watching it happen. When Vukovar was burnt down, it could have been stopped at that stage easily, I suspect with very, very little, if any, loss of life. All of us failed. All of us pretended that somehow it would go away, and it didn't. I think now, if one is very blunt, that the French and British must take a considerable responsibility for what is a double game, essentially giving the appearance of supporting Bosnia when they really are anxious to make sure that the former Yugoslavia remains disunited. I think the United States has to take a very heavy responsibility for pursuing the argument of lifting the embargo without being willing to put a single soldier at risk, which is an impossible position for a great power to adopt. And so if we're frank, all of us have made a bloody mess out of Bosnia, but unless you assume that all foreign policy in all Western countries is going to stop, what we have to do is draw from that lesson and go ahead and do it better next time. And in that context, having just come from the United Nations, I must say that I think it's important that we try to support it for what it's worth, which is better than not having the United Nations. And here I think the European Union has attempted to play a fairly constructive part.
Just, I think I would certainly in full agreement with what Shirley said, and it seems to me, by the way, that one of the lessons of the Bosnia fiasco is the need, at least, to start thinking seriously about a common European defense capacity. Even if the British and the French had been less craven than I think they were, and if they had wanted to intervene militarily, they didn't really have quite the means. Everything is integrated within NATO, which means that nothing can really be done without the Americans. Incidentally, American vacillations over Bosnia, even though the United States is a single country, were not any less numerous than European confusions over Bosnia. Sometimes a single government, when it is as complicated as the American one, can be as divided as a community of 12 or 15 members. But I think one of the lessons is indeed the need for the Europeans to try to organize their own defense system. And I think that if one starts planning a gradual integration of the East European countries into Europe, and if one wants to take into account the profound sense of insecurity which many of them are suffering from, this is an area in which an effective, not a paper or verbal West European Union can play a major role. Because if the West European Union becomes the defense arm of the European Union, then it seems to me the integration of the Eastern countries or Central European countries ought to take place both within the main body of the EU and within the West European Union. I'd like to come back for just a second to the first question which was asked and which had to do with the mission of this European Union. Here again I agree with Shirley that it cannot be only an economic enterprise. And I think this is true for two reasons. One is that if it is only an economic enterprise, especially if one moves towards monetary union, It means that one's economic policy will be largely set by an independent common central bank, which is not an entirely satisfactory situation in good democratic theory. The second reason is that economic life is now largely at the mercy of this mysterious business known as globalization. The European autonomy when it comes to economic matters is quite limited. In other words, much of their economic fate will be out of their hands, partly because it'll be in the hands of this autonomous central bank, but even more because it'll be in the hands of those millions of investors who move their money around and can ruin countries in 5 minutes. So there has to be something else. And this is where the trouble begins, because the something else has to be some sort of common social policy aimed, as Shirley said, at growth and employment. But this is one area which until now, in fact, governments have rather jealously kept for themselves. And yet, think of the following. It gets us back to this question of our relationship, for instance, with a country like Turkey. If you do not have a return to growth, or a decrease in unemployment, and particularly youth unemployment, the only common policy that I can very safely predict is going to be one of increasing common xenophobia, keeping the foreigners out, keeping the unwashed masses out. And if one wants a Europe which will be more humane, which will open its borders a bit to others, which will not look at others as essentially enemies who come to get our jobs, if you want to achieve something like this, you have first to get a return to growth and a return to employment. And that is part of the problem of Turkey, because what is in the minds of many of the Europeans, quite apart from issues of civilization, which are always, to me at least, a little bit mushy, is the simple fact that there's supposed to be open borders, and if you have open borders, the specter which comes to many people's mind in Western Europe is millions of Turkish workers moving in, unstoppable, because they would be behind, they would be inside the common house. Now, if one wants a slightly less defensive and slightly less, well, I would say racist and xenophobic attitude, you have to deal with issues both of education and of social policy, and they are even more than foreign policy and defense, about which one can talk forever and do nothing. They are the issues on which governments have preserved their, what is left of their sovereignty most jealously until now. And that, to me, is one of the big problems of the future substance of the European Union.
Okay, my name is Gerald Hörn. I'm a citizen of Austria, a student at the college, and a member of the Institute of Politics. And from both my experience in my home country and what all of the panelists have talked here, Europe seems to have two main problems. The first one is that the member states cannot agree on many issues, which leads the political party to be ineffective, partly because the Germans usually delegate things to the big corporations and the Bundesbank, the French state, we are French, and the British will probably say no. The second problem in Europe nowadays are quite serious economic implications, which are particularly high unemployment, very high labor costs, and partly a technological backwardness, particularly in comparison to the United States or Japan. And therefore I would like to ask the panelists two questions. The first one is, if Europe should adopt a centralized political body which has both major decision powers in economic and in political affairs. And the second question is whether Europe should adopt a more capitalistic system which would perhaps be able to cure some of the economic difficulties Europe is going through right now.
Thank you. I'll ask one of the panelists to respond since we have many questions.
In short, because we have many questions. First, globalization of economy, of course, confronts Europe with difficult questions about unemployment. Having said that, we need not so much a central commando. In fact, we have to change our societies to become more competitive. I won't say that is more capitalistic. here I can only speak as a former Dutch Prime Minister. My experience is that you really, with the cooperation of your population, you can improve the competitiveness of your society enough to create jobs. It would take too much time to explain that to you, but let's not be too pessimistic about it. It's possible. The second thing is to combine a strong government in Europe for those two reasons. I don't believe that. I think it will be much wiser to have specific approaches for the different chapters of the Treaty of Maastricht, as we call it. We have the Economic Monetary Union, that's one. I would make a plea to organize defense and foreign policy in a totally different structure, sui generis, in fact intergovernmental, with the leadership of the largest countries. That seems to me wiser than to bring all together in a system with the Commission and the European Parliament. So these are my two answers.
Thank you.
My name is Christiana Helmick. I'm from the Christian Science Monitor. With the development of a common European defense policy, do you foresee the end of NATO? And if not, how would a common European defense coexist with NATO?
I see no problem whatsoever. I mean, NATO is an intergovernmental organization. We go on with that. The only thing we do is to bring in a more substantial defense of the Europeans, as far as I'm concerned, all member states of the European Union, and a mechanism to coordinate our opinions better, and in crisis situations give the leadership to a few large nations to do business. And as the President of the United States have a good tradition to communicate with his main allies when it is needed, is the other way around the same. So I don't see there a fundamental problem. There was a time that one was a little bit afraid in the United States. What will this mean when the Europeans really develop to some own organization? My impression is that's over. They're more complaining about the Europeans not coordinating than about Europeans coordinating.
And just to add one additional sentence or two to that, as you may know, one of the proposals about WEU is that it should have the ability to produce purely European initiatives in some areas. One of these is peacekeeping, one of it is humanitarian aid, one of it is rescue operations. I don't know what's going to happen in the United States, but if some of the proposals that are now being discussed at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and elsewhere are pushed ahead to the point of a conclusion, so that the United States effectively knocks itself out of international peacekeeping, then it's absolutely vital that the WEU has some initiative in the area, because NATO will not be able to do that because it will not have American concurrence. And therefore, while I absolutely agree with Ruud Lubbers that I see no problem about WEU retaining a relationship, a partnership within NATO, WEU paradoxically might actually undertake some things that NATO will not be able to do if the decision is made to cease to provide any contribution to peacekeeping and any contribution to conflict resolution within the United Nations aegis. And certainly for myself, I'm seeing increasingly the United Nations looking more to Europe and more to Asia than to the United States because of these recent developments.
Yes.
My name is Dimitris Dopos. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School, and I'd like to return to the problem of Cyprus. I'm very pleased to have heard that Professor Williams mention that it's not a problem for Cyprus to enter. But I'm also puzzled why the other two speakers on the panel dodged the question. And I'd like to press them to mention, firstly, what are the prospects of Cyprus, since the problem has been around for the last 20 years. And politically, the European Union has been extremely ineffective in dealing with it, firstly. And secondly, what are the prospects of Cyprus joining the European Union, and to what extent is that decision connected to Turkey joining the European Union?
It's a subject about which I know nothing, and even though I know nothing about it, I have no opinion.
You have an opinion. You have to have an opinion.
Yes, and I said it may be a little bit too polite. I don't foresee in the short future in the near future, Cyprus to become member of the European Union, just to complicate it first. That's the answer. Is the clear answer or not?
Can you say why?
Yes, I can say why. Because, as I tried to explain first, there is a tradition of enlargement, but it is going gradually. And I think the best is to do it according to geographical parameters. And for that purpose and reason, I think it is more urgent to integrate now Poland, Czechia, Hungary. It's the first on the list. One can say Cyprus is already discussed for decades. That's true. But nevertheless, from a political point of view, the urgency of that is less than that of the countries I've just mentioned. That's a tough conclusion. That's the reason.
Yeah, so what happened to the values and idealism that you talked about? Is that just rhetoric?
No, it's no rhetoric. But just because to be effective in your in the purposes you have to discipline yourself as well in what you can do. Nice words are always very pleasant, especially in this sort of debates. I could dodge the question, as you say, and say, go home, and in a short time from now, you will see this will happen all. I'm trying to be frank with you. If I study the arithmetics and the problems of management within the European Union, I think it is not realistic to think that a number of countries like Cyprus, like Malta, will become members in a short period from now. I try to be frank with you.
I'd like to add one thing, which has to do with the fact that Cyprus is, after all, a country which has been forcibly divided. You have a major problem which has not been resolved. I don't see any great enthusiasm on the part of the other Europeans to become, in a sense, the inheritors of the problem of Cyprus's division. And if you are looking at what's happening now, Shirley mentioned it with respect to Eastern or Central Europe. Before these countries are going to become members, efforts are being made to resolve the minorities questions, to see to it that the European Union doesn't inherit all of the traditional minority tensions and hostilities. And it seems to me, at least as an outside observer, that as a prerequisite for a application which would have a chance of getting somewhere, the first order of business is to resolve that issue, which is a festering issue. Now, how you do that, whether the Europeans themselves can do it without the US, whether it should be done in the framework of the UN is another matter, but it seems to me that this is a prelude to any successful application.
So Stanley, you had an opinion after all.
Well, by listening to others, one gets opinions.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Fahad Dengler. I'm a European student here at the Kennedy School. My question was, there has been a lot of talk about that the European Union must be complemented by growth and employment policies. Now, obviously, the individual national governments haven't had a great success story over the past 10 or 20 years even in Europe. I wonder what value added a European government could add to those fields of politics, and whether it's really a sensible project to try to delegate more centralized economic policies to Brussels.
Yeah. Here we have a difference of opinion, because I heard that my two colleagues made quite a plea to give scope to the social dimension of Europe on the level of the European Union or the European community. Personally, I doubt that it's wise. The ambitions of all European member states have to be high in the social field as well. But when it comes to social policies, to implement that, I think social policies are so much related to the society itself, which is all different, and has so much to do with the responsibility of companies, with the mechanism of bargaining of trade unions with employers, that one can set certain minimum standards, and we have done that. It's not enough to activate social policies has to be done in the very first place near home, in the regions, in the cities, to a certain extent in the national capital, and only on a few fundamental questions on the European level. Having said that, there are a few elements which are important. I give you one example. As an economist, I'm convinced that in order to have enough employment, jobs in Europe, and growth in jobs, it will be wise to change the basis on which we collect our taxes in Europe. Much less in direct taxes and much more in so-called indirect taxes. If that point is taken by economists in the different countries, let's say in Europe, then of course the European Union can be instrumental, because such a shift is very difficult to achieve per country. There you have to come to a common conclusion to head into that direction. There you see an aspect which is very vital for employment, that the European Union as such has to be active. But when it comes to questions as temporary work, job sharing, and what have you, then I really believe, leave it to the member states themselves and go as deep as possible, bottom up in social policies. Try to avoid that you think now we have found a solution or a new system at the level of Brussels.
Can I disagree with that really briefly?
Yeah.
I think there is one important way in which the European Union can be helpful in respect of employment policy, and that was, I think, mentioned in the famous white paper on employment, competitiveness and growth, produced in Jacques Delors' last few months. And there, if you remember, he proposed that there should be investment, counter-cyclical investment in Europe-wide infrastructure. He referred particularly to public transport, to fiber optic structures and so forth. And that seems to me to have been a sensible idea, and by the nature of things could only be developed at the European level because it depended upon cross-border investment. The second point I would make is that, and I mentioned this earlier so I can be brief about it, my worry about a European central bank, which is almost entirely based upon the Bundesbank, is that it would occur in countries which do not have the social and institutional structures of Germany. Germany, I think, has been extremely clever over many years now at dealing with some of the most troubling downside political and social effects of unemployment. And I mentioned one of the most important, which is that unemployment among people between the ages of 16 and 25 is not any higher in Germany than is the general average of employment. That is only true of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. It's not true of any other country in Western Europe, where you get big divergences, particularly in the southern states, which I regard as being politically extremely dangerous. So my concern is that if you have a straight Bundesbank model in a non-German context, without some reference to the significance of balancing strict monetary considerations against the desirability of employment and growth, which the Federal Reserve Bank in this country has got, you will in fact get the kinds of monetary policies that could, I think, be politically and socially destructive. Now, how do you do that, given you've got to carry the Bundesbank with you? You can probably only do that, A, by making this an objective within the structures after the convergence criteria have been reached. There's no reason why you shouldn't do that. It's been suggested by a number of European countries. And second, you might have to adopt Europe-wide systems of apprenticeship training and things of that kind to try to deal with some of the aspects of unemployment that might otherwise emerge.
Since we only have a couple of minutes left, I'd like to ask each of our panelists maybe to make closing statements, maybe addressing some of the remarks made by the other panelists and whether you disagree or not on the last words.
I can be very short. I've listened carefully. There are maybe certain nuances between the three of us. Basically, I understand that I'm here next to two colleagues which want to go forward with Europe, first. Second, My second remark is I'm convinced that we are heading towards a few very difficult years. What I see today is sluggishness in the decision making. In fact, Maastricht was made in 1991 as a complicated treaty. In fact, it was not to the full a treaty. That what was about the economic monetary union was more or less a treaty, and we made binding agreements on a number of points. The other two aspects, that of the foreign and defense policy, and the so-called third pillar, matter concerning ministers for the interior and justice, were more action plans for the future. But nevertheless, there, the members of the European Council of that day, and many are still in function, have committed themselves, for example, to give substance to that famous defense identity in 1996. I am really worried that especially the larger member states are not very creative in their thinking. And the same for a number of other topics. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that I do not agree with Shirley Williams of the monetary union. If we start to accept that we make treaties, I accept there was an opt-out for the United Kingdom, but the others agreed to a certain calendrier, a timetable, then I would say stick to it, because if you stop the process of Europe, then it is very dangerous. You can see a process of unraveling. I don't exclude that risk. With all my enthusiasm, I don't exclude that risk. Having said that, I make a plea not to become too nervous. If needed, we'll take a little bit more time, but the objectives have to be clear. What has to be added, in my opinion, that is a fundamental remark, is let's get rid of the theoretical discussion too much about the architecture. Has it to be the German way? Has it to be the French way? Has it to be the British way? What I really make a plea for is that we go forward in the different areas, be prepared for indeed a Europe in which we find solutions per topic. Defense can be done in a different way as, for example, the monetary union. And so there are more examples. My last remark, and I try to be as specific as possible, I fully agree with Stanley Hoffman there where he said, there's nothing against the géométrie variable. We can go forward with a number of countries only in the beginning, and later on we see what countries will follow. The only point, of course, is that the perspective, that is in the end of the day, eventually all are welcome to participate in all segments of Europe. I think that is better to be flexible there and to go forward that way than to prolong too long the discussions about the optimal architecture for the whole of the European Union. That seems to me a little bit too complicated. That were my final, very practical remarks.
Thank you.
Well, my remarks would be very briefly these. I think that for the past nearly 50 years, a great deal of the security and the inspiration of the democratic part of the world has rested on the United States. I think the United States is, in a profound sense, more democratic than Europe. I think Europe is a country which has still got a certain deferential attitude, a certain willingness to hand over to the elite to lead it, with the great exception of a country like Holland. We are, in a sense, too led, and I don't think the European Union has yet adequately given a voice to the people of Europe because it doesn't trust enough the people of Europe. But I say with disappointment that I think the United States no longer wishes to play that role. And therefore my sense is that there is no escape from Europe having to carry a large part of the burden of trying to retain some kind of new world order. I don't like the phrase. Some kind of structure, if you like, of security and peace in a large part of the world. I think that one hopes that it will find allies in unexpected places like South Africa, like Japan and elsewhere. but I think we're looking at the passing of an era, and it's not a passing of an era that I feel entirely happy about, but in life one has to accept reality, and I think that is the reality.
Just two points. I think on the first one, I agree entirely with Shirley that but the main problem, it seems to me, is that for the last 45 years or 50 years, the Europeans have gotten into a habit of dependence on the United States, or else on simply saying no to what the United States is proposing, which is exactly the same thing. It's another form of the same habit of dependence. And it's going to be extremely hard to overcome, because the cocoon was a nice one, the sense of protection was nice, and it saved one from having to think about collective enterprises. Second point, and here I disagree a little bit with Mr. Lubers. If one wants to give some substance to that enterprise, one has, alas, and I'm sure that Shirley agrees, to think about architecture, to think about introducing the people into what otherwise remains a very bizarre construction. One has to think about making the institutions more effective. And especially if one moves toward the Europe of 20 or 25 states. So I think maybe the conference, which is supposed to begin in '96, will be only one stage in this long march. But too complicated, too Byzantine a machinery as it is now, and is likely to become even more so if the Central Europeans join, goes exactly against what many of us hope, which is a Europe which is more effective as a unit, both in internal affairs, economic and social, and in playing a role in the world. So even though we didn't talk much about institutions tonight, we shouldn't forget that it is not only an issue for professors of constitutional law and political science.
Well, with that, let me thank our panelists. Thank you very much.